There is a photograph, an image that very few people know in its full story. In it, a 17-year-old boy weeps in the arms of an adult man, on a football pitch, surrounded by 50,000 people screaming in a language he barely understands. That boy came from a small town in the interior of Minas Gerais, Brazil, the son of a footballer who never quite made it, grew up without shoes, dodged police officers to play ball in the streets of Bauru, and on that specific day, June 29, 1958, in Stockholm, Sweden, he changed football forever. You already know his name. But what happened behind the scenes of that World Cup, you probably have never heard. Get ready, because what I'm about to tell you is not the story that textbooks keep repeating. This is the real story, with everything that stayed hidden in the shadows of one of the greatest glories in Brazilian football history. A story of betrayal within the squad, of a young man who almost wasn't even called up, of political games inside the delegation, of a coach who bet on the impossible, and of a boy who laced up borrowed boots to compete in the most important World Cup in Brazil's history. Let's go back 2 years. In 1956, Brazil was still carrying a wound that hadn't healed. The year was 1950, and the Maracanã, freshly inaugurated, was the largest stadium in the world. Brazil only needed a draw against Uruguay to lift the trophy. And then happened what nobody dared to name. Uruguay won 2-1. The silence that fell over the Maracanã that afternoon was described by journalists as the sound of an entire country breaking in half. The Brazilian players hid for years. Some were never recognized on the streets again without feeling shame. Goalkeeper Barbosa, who let in the fateful goal, carried that defeat like a curse until the day he died, in 2000, saying that in Brazil the maximum sentence for a crime was 30 years in prison, but that he had been serving a life sentence ever since. That open wound shaped everything the Brazilian national team did in the years that followed. The 1954 World Cup in Switzerland also ended badly, a quarter-final elimination against Hungary in a match that became known as the Battle of Bern, perhaps the most violent game in World Cup history, with punches thrown, boots flying, and the confrontation continuing in the locker rooms after the final whistle. Brazil arrived at 1958 carrying 8 years of trauma, of pressure, of national shame. And it was precisely in that moment that a boy stepped onto the pitch. Edson Arantes do Nascimento was 15 years old when he was sold by América de Bauru to Santos Football Club in 1956. His father, Dondinho, was a footballer who never managed to shine, partly because of a knee injury that cut short his career at its peak. Pelé, a nickname given by schoolmates that he hated as a child, but that the entire world would eventually adopt, grew up watching his father cry over his unfulfilled career, and swore to himself that he would never let that happen to him. By the age of 16, he was already considered a revelation at Santos. But what very few people know is that Pelé almost didn't go to the 1958 World Cup. Coach Vicente Fiola had doubts. Pelé was suffering from an injury in his right knee, ironically, the same type of injury that had destroyed his father's career. The Brazilian delegation's doctors were divided in their opinions. There was enormous pressure against risking a young, inexperienced player in a World Cup. The conservative logic said, why field a 17-year-old boy when you have experienced players available? But there was something more complicated happening behind the scenes of the delegation. The CBF had hired, for the first time in history, a psychologist to travel with the squad. His name was João Carvalhais, and his report on Pelé was devastating. Carvalhais evaluated Pelé and concluded, in technical terms, that the young man lacked the psychological maturity to withstand the pressure of a World Cup. In his official assessment, he wrote that Pelé displayed traits of immaturity and was not fit to compete in a tournament of such magnitude. That document genuinely existed. It was filed away for decades. And if the CBF's directors had followed the psychologist's recommendation to the letter, Brazil would have gone to the 1958 World Cup without Pelé. The entire history of world football would be completely different. But there was one man who refused to accept that report as a verdict. Coach Vicente Fiola, a heavy-set, calm man with a quiet voice and a perceptive gaze, watched that boy train and said that the psychologist's report meant nothing compared to what he saw with his own eyes. Fiola had a rare gift, the ability to see potential where others saw inexperience. And he saw in Pelé something that no document could capture. A naturalness with a ball that seemed supernatural, a football instinct that no training had taught, because there is no training in the world capable of teaching that. Either you are born with that gift or you are not. The Sweden 1958 tournament was the most technically advanced World Cup to that point. It was the first cup broadcast widely across European television. It was the first time the world would watch football live in their living rooms. And there was a clear favorite in European eyes, Sweden itself, playing at home, backed by experienced players. On the other side of the continent, there was France with Raymond Kopa and a young man named Just Fontaine, who would finish the tournament with 13 goals, a record that remains untouched to this day. There was West Germany, the 1954 champions. There was the Soviet Union, still at the height of its golden era. And there was Brazil, arriving with its flair, its magic, its creativity, but also with its history of stumbling at the most decisive moments. Brazil opened against Austria and won 3-0. Then drew with England 0-0 in a tense, uninspired match where tactical caution smothered natural talent. And then came the game against the Soviet Union, and it was in that game that history made its first great turn. Viola decided to change everything. He put Garrincha and Pelé in the starting lineup for the first time in the tournament. Both were 17 years old. Both were wild, unpredictable, brilliant. And in the opening minutes of that game, the two of them nearly drove the Soviets crazy simultaneously. Garrincha down the right, Pelé through the center, in a combination of pace and magic that the defenders simply could not follow. Brazil won 2-0, and the World Cup's world began paying attention to a team that seemed to play at a different rhythm from the rest of humanity. In the quarterfinals, Brazil faced Wales. Pelé scored the game's only goal, the one that eliminated the Welsh, and became in that moment the youngest player in history to score in a World Cup knockout stage. He was 17 years and 239 days old. That record still stands today. Think about it. In more than 60 years of World Cups after that day, no younger player has managed to repeat that feat. In the semi-finals, the opponent was Just Fontaine's France, the tournament's top scorer. It was the match everyone feared, because the French were on a goal-scoring rampage. But Brazil that afternoon was not a football team. It was a spectacle. Pelé scored 3 goals. 3. In a World Cup semi-final. At age 17, Brazil won 5-2, and when Pelé scored the 5th, a goal he himself described decades later as the most beautiful of his entire career, the entire stadium fell silent for a single second, a second of collective disbelief, before erupting into an ovation that mixed Swedish applause with the screams of Brazilians in the stands. And then came the final. June 29, 1958. Stockholm. Råsunda Stadium. Brazil versus Sweden, the host nation, in front of their own supporters, in the presence of a king, King Gustav VI Adolf of Sweden, seated in the stands, and before 50,000 people who expected to see their team lift the trophy on home soil. Sweden scored early. First goal. The stadium exploded in joy. It was Sweden's dream becoming reality. And then Brazil showed the world what it means to play football with soul. Vava equalized. And then put Brazil ahead. And then Pelé did something nobody had done before at that level, on that stage. He received the ball with his back to goal, lifted it into the air with his chest, let it drop, spun, and struck it on the volley before it touched the ground, watching it curl into the corner. Goal. The Swedish commentator lost his composure. Not in anger, in admiration. Because there was something about that goal that transcended the rivalry, that transcended the scoreline, that transcended any sense of national feeling. It was art. It was something human beings had not seen before. And when that goal went in, even the Swedish supporters applauded. Brazil won 5-2. And when the referee blew the final whistle, Pelé collapsed to the ground. Not in celebration. In emotional breakdown. He began crying uncontrollably, like a child, because he was a child. His teammates, grown men who had suffered through the trauma of 1950, came to embrace him. And it was in that moment that the photograph was taken. Pelé in the arms of Didi, one of the squad's most experienced players, crying like someone who has just understood the weight of what has happened. That image traveled the world. It reached the front pages of newspapers in countries that barely knew where Brazil was on a map. And in that moment, the entire planet learned a name. But there is a detail in this story that almost nobody tells. After the match, King Gustav VI Adolf of Sweden himself came down from the stands to congratulate the Brazilian players on the pitch. It was absolutely unusual. It was against royal protocol. A European monarch does not descend to congratulate the opposing team on the grass after a final. But the king could not resist. He wanted to see up close that 17-year-old boy who had done something no other human being had done before in that sport. And when he shook Pelé's hand, the King of Sweden said, in English, because Pelé spoke no Swedish and the king spoke no Portuguese, that he had just witnessed the greatest football player in the world. That statement, made by a European monarch on his own soil, after a defeat, to the representative of a country that Europe barely knew, was one of the most powerful declarations in the history of sport. Brazil returned home as world champions for the first time. And what happened in the streets of Brazil in the hours that followed is one of the most emotionally charged scenes in the country's history. People who had never met embraced one another in the streets. Workers stopped working. Farmers in the interior of the Northeast, who barely had a radio, stopped everything to hear the news. It was 1958. Brazil was a country still struggling to understand itself, carrying immense social contradictions, living through a period of profound political transformation. Juscelino Kubitschek was building Brasilia. The country was trying to modernize, trying to enter the world with dignity. And that title was, for many Brazilians, the first time in their lives they felt that Brazil could be the best in the world at something. And Pelé? Pelé returned to Brazil as a 17-year-old boy who had changed history. But his life didn't get easy overnight. He was still poor. Still living in a modest house. Still sending money to his father. Still dreaming about the future with the innocence of someone who knows the world has just changed, but doesn't yet know exactly how. In the years that followed, there would be the 1962 World Cup, where he got injured and Brazil won anyway, proof that that generation was greater than any individual. There would be 1966, where Brazil was eliminated shamefully and Pelé was hunted by European defenders as though he were prey, kicked and shoved, and he left the tournament saying he would never play in a World Cup again. And there would be 1970, in Mexico, where he returned and delivered to the world the greatest spectacle of collective football ever seen. A team that to this day is considered the most beautiful and complete in history. But it all started there. In Stockholm. In the tears of a 17-year-old boy. In that embrace on a European pitch. In that photograph that the whole world saw and that few people can fully explain. Football was never the same after 1958. Not only because Brazil won, but because the world saw, for the first time, that this sport could be poetry. That a leather ball and two human feet could create moments that transcended every border, every language, every cultural difference. Football had always been the most popular sport on earth. But after 1958, it also became the most beautiful. If you made it this far in the video, I want you to do one thing right now. Write in the comments what you thought of this story. Tell me your city and your country, because this channel welcomes visitors from all across Brazil and from every corner of the world, and I love knowing where you're all watching from. Drop a like if you enjoyed this dive into history, because that helps the channel grow enormously and keeps these stories, the ones hidden in the archives of world football, coming. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit subscribe right now. The button is right down there. It takes 1 second, and you will not want to miss what's coming next. Speaking of football and nostalgia, in the pinned comments you'll find a curious recommendation, something I came across recently that I thought was really interesting for anyone who loves this golden era of the game. I won't spoil the surprise here. Go check it out, but only after you've left the like. And before you go, let me tell you something. What you saw today is just a fraction of what's stored in the archives of world football. There are stories that will leave you speechless. There are secrets that no documentary has ever told. There are matches, behind-the-scenes moments, and turning points that changed entire nations, and they're about to be revealed right here. Stay tuned. The next video will be impossible to ignore.